important question we have to ask is the commandment that we often see in the Tanakh to be fruitful and multiply. Does this apply to B'nai Noach? And these are the kind of questions that we have because we know that all of humanity is commanded in 7 mitzvot, 6 from the time of Adam and a 7th from the time of Noah. We also know that from Abraham onwards, there was a subset of humanity that had its own path with its own mitzvot. Now, all of humanity at that time could be categorized as B'nai Noach. When I say at that time, I'm talking about the chronological period that's covered in the book of Genesis. Once the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, the subset of humanity that would be called Abraham's children, which again used to belong to the general category of B'nai Noach, became distinct as the Jewish people. In the book of Genesis, besides the 7 mitzvot that are embedded in the verses, there are 3 explicit commands. One, that both Adam and Noah were commanded to procreate, to produce children. 2, Abraham was commanded to be circumcised and to circumcise the males of his household, both children and servants. And finally, 3, there is a commandment not to eat the sinew vein of an animal, which we call the Gid HaNasheh, which commemorates the place where the angel injured Jacob during their struggle on Jacob's way back to the land of Israel. Now, technically speaking, again, there was not a Jewish people until the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Prior to this, everybody was Noahide. We also know that the 7 mitzvot that humanity was originally commanded was restated close to the time of the giving of the Torah. And that the 613 mitzvot of the Torah that was eventually given to the Jewish people includes, that list includes the original 7. So you have 7 plus 606 additional mitzvot, which are given at Mount Sinai. Since the 3 mitzvot that are explicitly mentioned in Genesis were commanded to people who were B'nai Noach, all the forefathers of the Jewish people and the foremothers of the Jewish people, everybody that you read about in the book of Genesis is a Noahide. So the question arises, are these mitzvot still applicable to Noahides? And the reason why the question comes up is because we don't see these mitzvot in the list of the 7 Noahide laws. So the first source we're going to go to is in Tractate Sanhedrin, page 59a, where we have a basic formula for answering this question as to whether or not these 3 mitzvot that are mentioned explicitly in the book of Genesis still apply to the B'nai Noach. And it goes as follows. This comes from Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Hanina. He said, any mitzvah, a law that was given to humanity prior to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, but was then repeated during the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, that law remains in force for both B'nai Israel and B'nai Noach. If a law that was given to the Bnei Noach was not repeated at Sinai, which means that we won't find it anywhere else in the text except where we derive them in the book of Genesis. In that case, it's only applicable to Bnei Yisrael. In other words, laws that were originally given to Noahides like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, if these laws are not repeated during the giving of the Torah, they are no longer in force for Noahides and are only applicable to the Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people. According to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and as explained in the commentary of Rashi, only one of these three mitzvot that we find in the book of Genesis was not repeated at Mount Sinai. Specifically, the prohibition of eating the gid hanasheh, the sinew vein, which is found in the back thigh of an animal. Just explain that what generally happens in a kosher slaughterhouse is that there are certain parts of the animal that are used by kosher meat companies, and there are other parts of the animal which are then given to non-Jews, that are bought by other companies to be sold as non-kosher meat because the sinew vein has not been extracted from the rear of the animal. Now, there is a practice called nikor, or in Yiddish, tribrin, which is a specialty within the field of kashrut, where the shochet knows how to extract the sinew vein. There is such a thing. In that case, the entirety of the animal could be used. According to what we see in the Gemara and Rashi, only this mitzvah of the three that we find in the book of Genesis is not repeated at Sinai, and therefore we know it definitely only applies to the Bnei Yisrael. Now, the Gemara raised an objection. It says, wait a minute. We see that the commandment to Abraham to circumcise in Genesis chapter 17, verse 9, is repeated at Sinai, where in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 3, where the commandment to circumcise on the 8th day of a baby boy's life is restated. So, does circumcision apply to Bnei Noach? The Gemara resolves this question by telling us that the reason why the commandment is restated is to teach us something else. It's to teach us that even on the Sabbath, circumcision can be performed. We would have thought that circumcision couldn't be performed because of the Sabbath. This second restatement of the commandment to circumcise is there in order to teach that we can. Now, of course, as we know, only the Jews keep the Sabbath, so that's a piece of information, an additional piece of information about this mitzvah that would only apply to Jews. So therefore, the repetition is technically not really a repetition that would make circumcision mandatory for the Bnei Noach. It only applies to Jews. I'm going to read from the Rambam where he addresses this point in Laws of Kings and Wars, chapter 7, halacha 7. He says, only Abraham and his descendants were commanded regarding circumcision, as Genesis chapter 17, verses 9 through 10 states, keep my covenant, you and your offspring, circumcise every male. The descendants of Ishmael are excluded, as implied by Genesis chapter 21, verse 12, where it says that it's through Isaac that your offspring will be called. You might know that in the Muslim faith, it is customary to circumcise the males, as Abraham circumcised Ishmael. That's something that is brought in our Torah. But when the line, the spiritual descendancy from Abraham is established, God says, "Ki b'Yitzchak yikar lecha zera," and therefore all other descendants of Abraham who are not currently part of the Jewish people are not required any longer to perform the commandment of circumcision. He continues and says Esau's descendants are also excluded, for Isaac told Jacob in Genesis chapter 28, verse 4, "May God grant Abraham's blessing to you and your descendants," implying that only he is the true offspring of Abraham who maintains his faith and his upright behavior, and thus they alone are obligated in circumcision. And we're going to come back to this Rambam a little bit later. Now, the Gemara then raises another objection. We skip forward a little bit, which is the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, procreate. It's not only stated multiple times in the book of Genesis. For example, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 7, which is really the second time that God speaks to Noah about that. It's also restated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 26. Now, here the Gemara resolves the question in a similar way. The repetition of the commandment in Deuteronomy is also not a real repetition of the commandment. The verse in Deuteronomy is describing how the B'nai Israel were commanded to observe a period of purity prior to the giving of the Torah, which we refer to as the 3 days before Shavuot, 3 days before the Torah was given. The men separated from their wives. They were to remain in a state of spiritual purity, which would allow them to be proper vessels to receive Torah. And that this 3-day period was ended with the command, "Go return to your tents," which means that marital relations are permitted again. Now, what we learn from this is an additional piece of information. Not that there's a commandment to be fruitful and multiply. We know that already from the book of Genesis. But rather, we learn from this an interesting halakha, that when a decree is made by a Beit Din, you need another Beit Din, which is equal in stature to nullify the original decree. Now, of course, since God was the one who decreed the separation in the first place, God is the one who then also nullifies the decree at the end of the 3-day period. And so that's how it fits into this idea that you need a Beit Din that's at least equal, if not greater, b'chochma, over minyan, in wisdom and in number, to nullify the original Beit Din. So what do we learn from this? We learn that this is also not an actual repetition of the commandment, and therefore it's not applicable to B'nai Noach, only to the Jews. Okay, have we answered our question yet? Do we say from here that Noahites are not obligated to have children? At this point, the simple language of the Gemara seems to be that Noahites are not obligated to have children. Not that they shouldn't have children. Not that it isn't an amazing blessing to have children, to raise wonderful people in the world. That's a wonderful thing. It's just that they don't transgress anything if they haven't procreated. They have a get out of jail card in this regard. Okay, but when we look at Tosfot commenting on the Gemara, there's another dimension that's added here. It's true, the mitzvah to procreate was not repeated at Sinai. But does this mean that it really does not apply to Noahites? And Tosfot then cites a previous passage in the Gemara where it stated that the list of 7 mitzvot only pertain to the negative prohibitions that are commanded of Noahites. If you look at the list of the 7, they all refer to things that Noahites should not do. All the don'ts. And the one mitzvah to establish courts of law to enforce all the don'ts. Okay, So essentially, we're looking at a list of negative commandments. That's the only thing that you see listed in the list of 7, the implication being, according to Tosfot, according to that Gemara that comes earlier, is that there are positive mitzvot that Noahides must follow as well, and procreation is one of them. We also find an interesting question that's asked centuries earlier than that commentary of Tosfot, of Rav Achai Gaon, who was perhaps the greatest rabbinic scholar in Babylonia, which was a great Jewish community. That's where the Talmud Bavli was written, the Babylonian Talmud. In the 8th century, Rav Achai Gaon was fit to be the head of the academy, the great academy in Pumbedita, but because of political issues that were going on at the time, he was passed over for that position, at which point he just left and moved to Eretz Israel. His work, known as the She'il Tot, is one of the earliest works of rabbinic responsa literature, where questions of Jewish law are asked and answered and then published and publicized throughout the Jewish world, which by the 8th century was a very large diaspora, covering not only Babylonia and the whole Mesopotamian crescent, but also moving across North Africa into Spain eventually, and up through the Italian peninsula into the Rhine River Valley. Okay, so people were writing to the Gaonim from all over the world, basically. In this particular piece of responsa, which is number 165 in the She'il Tot, the one who asked the question refers not to the verse in Genesis or in Deuteronomy, but to a verse in Jeremiah, chapter 29, verse 6, where it states, "Take wives and give birth to sons and daughters." And then the question is asked, are non-Jews obligated to procreate as well, since the verse in Genesis chapter 9, verse 7 states, "And you be fruitful and multiply." In other words, we see this verse in Jeremiah. It seems to be aimed at the Jews, but we know that earlier verses, such as that verse in Genesis, was spoken to Noah and to his children. So just stepping back for a second, it's very fascinating that this question is being asked in Babylonia in the 8th century, because this, again, is responsa literature. This is not simply a compendium of interesting novellae and ideas on the Talmud. This is a type of literature that is meant to be used practically for practical application of the halakha. What was driving people to ask whether or not the mitzvah to procreate was applicable to Noahides? It's fascinating. Or it doesn't say Noahides in the text; it says to non-Jews, but that means Noahides for all intents and purposes. And curiously, Rav Achai Gaon doesn't directly address this question in his answer. What do we make of that? Does the absence of an answer mean yes, it does apply, or no, it doesn't apply? We don't know. But in the 19th century, 11 centuries later, we have Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the famous Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva. Well, he authored a commentary on the She'il Tot called the Hamek She'elah. And he references a passage in Tractate Yevamot 62a, also one in Chagiga, page 2b, where the commentaries of Rashi and Tosfot respectively apply the obligation of procreation to B'nai Noach. There's a disagreement between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in the Gemara as to whether or not a convert has fulfilled the mitzvah of procreation if he had children before he converted. Right? Has a family, has produced children, and then converts. Has this person fulfilled the mitzvah of procreation or not? Rabbi Yochanan says yes, because B'nai Noach are subject to the mitzvah of procreation. This seems to go against the Gemara that we saw before from Sanhedrin. Whereas Reish Lakish may agree that they are subject to that mitzvah, but since one's familial ties change when one converts, it's as if the child he had before he converted is halachically unrelated to him. And just a point on that, that's not to invalidate the relationship or the love or the connection that exists between parent and child or siblings or parent family members when there's a conversion. But what happens is when a person converts, they are like a newborn child. Right? You hear the expression born agains when it refers to Christianity. That comes from somewhere. Okay? And when somebody is born again, so to speak, when a person is a newborn child because of a spiritual transition, that reorganizes the relationships. They're starting fresh again in the world. And the Torah doesn't really look to genetics when it comes to spiritual heredity. We'll get into that more at a different point. In Tractate Chagiga, the verse in Isaiah, chapter 45, verse 18 is cited. The verse there states, he did not create it to be a waste. God did not create this world for it to just be a waste or purposeless. He formed it to be inhabited. The Gemara is referring to the case of a servant whose legal status is that of half free and half slave. Now, the problem of being half a free person and half a slave is that that person cannot marry either a maidservant, a female slave, nor can that person marry a free woman, because they're sort of in no man's land. And therefore, because the world was created to be inhabited, we force the owner of the slave to grant him a fully freed status so that he can marry a free woman and therefore procreate. Okay. So that's where we are with that. I want to go back to the Rambam that we saw before in Hilchot Melachim in chapter 10, Halacha 7, where he states clearly that B'nai Noach are not obligated in circumcision. But interestingly, if you'll remember, like Rav Achai Gaon, he doesn't say anything about procreation. The Rambam simply doesn't mention it there. And here again, we could take the ambiguity in either direction. We've seen certain authorities that do apply the mitzvah of procreation to B'nai Noach. On the other hand, there are others, such as the Mishnah Lamelech, which is a commentary on the Rambam, and the Avnei Miluim, and the Aruch LaNer, who hold that when sages apply the mitzvah of procreation to B'nai Noach, they are referring to the period before the giving of the Torah, which is in line with the original formula that we saw in Tractate Sanhedrin, that since this is not a mitzvah that was repeated during the giving of the Torah, it's a mitzvah that is no longer in force for B'nai Noach. I think there is definitely a case to be made, though, that since there are opinions that say that they are, and since it in any case is a very positive thing to happen, that I'm not going to give what they call a psak halacha, like a definite authoritative ruling, but I think there's definitely, what we do, at least in Jewish law, is when there are a multitude of opinions, we try to cover all of the opinions. We try to behave in such a way that we manage to satisfy all opinions. And this way, we can be sure that we've fulfilled the mitzvot that we've been given. Does that operate in the same way? Do we have that same kind of principle when it comes to Noahide law? That's an interesting question. We're going to have to delve deeper into it. But for now, let's have this as food for thought.